The generator's hum died at 3:17 a.m., and Marcus Chen's dialysis machine went silent. In the darkness, he felt death creeping through his bloodstream as his HOA president stood outside, bolt cutters gleaming in the moonlight. "Medical emergency. Exemptions don't exist in Willowbrook Estates," Karen Whitmore had declared. But she had no idea that the quiet engineer she'd just condemned had spent 15 years designing military-grade power systems. By dawn, a convoy of battery trailers would transform the entire neighborhood into a blazing monument to her cruelty. And Karen would discover that some people fight back with the fury of a man who refuses to die quietly. The notification chimed on Marcus Chen's phone at 11:47 p.m., jolting him awake in his hospital bed at home. "Dialysis cycle will begin in 30 minutes. Prepare for connection." He rolled over carefully, mindful of the catheter port beneath his shirt, and switched on the bedside lamp. The peritoneal dialysis machine hummed quietly in the corner of his bedroom, a sleek white tower that had become both his lifeline and his prison. 4 times a day, every day for the past 8 months since his kidney failure, the machine cycled, fresh dialysate fluid through his abdomen, filtering toxins his body could no longer process. The generator outside kicked on with its familiar rumble. Marcus had installed the backup power system 3 months ago after the second neighborhood blackout left him scrambling to find emergency dialysis at the hospital. The HOA had initially objected to the unsightly industrial equipment, but his doctor's letter citing medical necessity had silenced their complaints, or so he'd thought. Marcus connected the tubing to his catheter and settled back into bed as the machine began its 4-hour cycle. The gentle whir of the pump and the soft beeping of monitors had become his lullaby. He was drifting back to sleep when he heard voices outside. "Told you this was unacceptable." Medical necessity documentation. Property values and neighborhood standards. Marcus sat up, recognizing the sharp tenor of Karen Whitmore's voice cutting through the night air. As HOA president, Karen had made herself the unofficial guardian of Willowbrook Estate's pristine aesthetic standards. She'd fined the Johnsons for their garden gnome, forced the Patels to repaint their mailbox from cheerful yellow to approved beige, and waged a 3-year war against Mrs. Rodriguez's rose garden for being excessively colorful. The voices grew louder. Marcus pulled on a robe and peered through his bedroom window. In his side yard, illuminated by the motion sensor, lights, Karen stood with 2 other HOA board members, Bill Hartman and Susan Mills, examining his generator setup. All 3 wore matching windbreakers with the HOA logo, as if they were conducting some official midnight raid. Karen held a tablet, scrolling through what looked like HOA regulations. Section 4.2.1 clearly states that generators may not operate between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. without special permits. "But Marcus has a medical exemption," Susan said, sounding uncomfortable. "Dr. Patel's letter specifically..." "Medical exemptions apply to the installation, not the operational restrictions," Karen interrupted. "The noise ordinance supersedes medical considerations after 10 p.m. Marcus felt his chest tighten, not from his kidney disease, but from pure disbelief. He opened his window and called down, "Karen, what's going on?" The 3 board members looked up. Karen's expression hardened when she saw him. Even in the artificial light, Marcus could see the determination etched in her angular features. She wore her graying hair in a severe bob that somehow made her look both authoritative and petty simultaneously. "Mr. Chen," she called up formally, "we're here regarding multiple noise complaints about your generator." "Noise complaints? It's quieter than most air conditioning units. Nevertheless, it violates our quiet hours policy. The generator must be shut down immediately." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. The dialysis machine was halfway through its cycle. Interrupting the process now would not only waste expensive dialysate fluid, but could leave dangerous toxins in his system. "Karen, I'm in the middle of dialysis. This machine keeps me alive. The generator can't be shut down for another 2 hours. Medical needs don't override community standards, Mr. Chen. The rules exist for everyone's benefit. The callousness of her statement hit him like a physical blow. Marcus climbed out of bed, his movements careful to avoid disturbing the tubing connected to his abdomen, and made his way downstairs. He opened the front door and walked around to the side yard, his bare feet cold against the damp grass. "Look," he said, gesturing to the dialysis machine visible through his bedroom window. "That machine is filtering my blood right now. If the power goes out, I could go into toxic shock. I could die." Karen's expression didn't soften. "That sounds like a personal problem, not a community responsibility. Perhaps you should have considered that before choosing to live in a deed-restricted community." Bill Hartman shifted uncomfortably. "Karen, maybe we could—" "No exceptions," she cut him off. "We start making exceptions for medical equipment. Where does it end? Next week it'll be someone's oxygen concentrator. The month after that, someone will claim they need a backup generator for their insulin refrigeration. Property values in this neighborhood depend on consistent standards." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "You're comparing my kidney dialysis to someone's insulin fridge?" Medical equipment is medical equipment. The HOA covenants are clear about noise restrictions and aesthetic standards. Your generator violates both. My generator is positioned behind privacy screening, and it's quieter than— "Mr. Chen." Karen's voice carried the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The board has voted. The generator must comply with noise ordinances or be removed entirely." "When did the board vote?" "I never received notice of a meeting." Karen pulled out her phone and showed him an email thread. "Emergency board meeting. Electronic voting is permitted under our bylaws for urgent matters affecting community welfare." Marcus scrolled through the messages. The emergency meeting had taken place over email in the past 2 hours. Karen had initiated it at 9:43 p.m. after Marcus's generator had automatically started its scheduled pre-dialysis power check. The vote was 3-2 in favor of immediate enforcement of noise restrictions. "This is insane," Marcus said. "You're literally asking me to risk my life over a noise complaint." "We're asking you to follow the same rules as everyone else," Susan said, though she wouldn't meet his eyes. "Susan, you know this is wrong." She looked at Karen, then back at Marcus. "The covenants are the covenants, Marcus. We can't just ignore them." Marcus turned to Bill. "Bill, your wife had cancer. You understand medical equipment." Bill's jaw worked silently for a moment. "This is different, Marcus. Jenny's chemo pump was inside the house. It didn't affect the neighbors. Neither does this. Listen, can you hear it running?" They all paused. The generator was indeed running, but its sound was barely audible over the ambient noise of the neighborhood, distant traffic, air conditioning units, the occasional dog bark. "Volume isn't the issue," Karen said. "Policy is policy." Marcus felt desperation creeping into his voice. "Karen, please, just tonight. Let me finish this cycle, and tomorrow I'll talk to my doctor about alternatives. The violation is occurring right now. Immediate compliance is required." She reached into her windbreaker and pulled out a pair of bolt cutters. Marcus's blood went cold. "What are those for?" "If you won't shut down the generator voluntarily, we'll disable the electrical connection ourselves." "You can't do that. That's destruction of property." "It's enforcement of community standards. The HOA covenants grant us authority to remedy violations when homeowners refuse to comply voluntarily." Marcus took a step back, his mind racing. The dialysis machine had maybe 90 minutes left in its cycle. If the power went out now, he'd need to get to the hospital immediately for emergency treatment. At this hour, that meant an ambulance ride and a night in the ER. "Karen, listen to me carefully. If you cut that power line, you could kill me." She hefted the bolt cutters. "Drama doesn't change policy, Mr. Chen." The words hit Marcus like ice water. In that moment, he realized that Karen Whitmore, this woman who obsessed over mailbox colors and garden gnome violations, was fully prepared to let him die rather than bend her precious rules. "You're serious," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'd actually risk my life over this. I'm enforcing the covenants that every homeowner agreed to follow. Your medical condition doesn't make you special." Bill and Susan exchanged glances, but neither moved to stop her. Marcus pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," Karen said. "They'll tell you this is a civil matter between you and the HOA. We have legal authority to enforce our covenants." She was right, and they both knew it. The police wouldn't intervene in what they'd see as a property dispute, especially with Marcus's signature on the HOA agreement clearly visible in the association's records. "Please," Marcus said, hating the sound of begging in his own voice. "Just give me 2 hours. 2 hours, and then I'll shut it down myself." Karen checked her watch. "It's 12:23 a.m. You've had over 2 hours since the quiet period began. This ends now." She stepped toward the generator housing. Marcus moved to block her path. "Karen, stop. Think about what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing." "Step aside, or we'll file trespassing charges against you for interfere." Marcus disconnected from the dialysis machine manually, his hands steady despite the rage coursing through his veins. The incomplete cycle left him feeling sluggish and nauseous, but he'd experienced worse during his military deployments. What he couldn't tolerate was the casual cruelty of Karen Whitmore's actions. At 4:30 a.m., he stood in his basement workshop, surveying equipment that most people would mistake for an electronics hoarder's paradise. To Marcus, it was a carefully curated arsenal of power generation and distribution technology. Lithium battery banks lined one wall, their LED indicators glowing softly in the dim light. Industrial inverters sat on steel shelving beside DC to AC converters rated for hospital-grade equipment. Coils of heavy-gauge copper wire hung from ceiling hooks like metallic snakes. But the crown jewel sat in the corner covered by a canvas tarp, a prototype mobile power unit he'd been developing for disaster relief organizations. The trailer-mounted system could generate and store enough electricity to power a field hospital for 3 days. Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in 2 years. Torres Miguel, 82nd Engineer Battalion, Reti. The SAT phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "This better be life or death, Chen. I've got PT at 0600. Miguel, it's Marcus, and it might actually be life or death." The tone shifted immediately. Miguel Torres had served 2 tours as Marcus's demolition sergeant in Afghanistan. When Marcus designed power systems for remote bases, Miguel made sure they stayed operational, under mortar fire. Their professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared experiences that civilian friends couldn't understand. "Talk to me." Marcus explained the situation, keeping his voice level and factual. Miguel listened without interruption, but Marcus could hear his breathing change as the story progressed. "Let me get this straight," Miguel said when Marcus finished. "This HOA Karen literally cut your power while you were on dialysis?" "Severed the main electrical line with bolt cutters. Left me with incomplete treatment and toxic fluid in my system." "Jesus Christ, Marcus, you could have died." That was apparently an acceptable risk to preserve neighborhood quiet hours. A long pause. "What do you need?" "Remember that mobile power unit I was working on for the Red Cross contract? The one that could light up a refugee camp? That's the one. I need help getting it operational, and I need it by tonight." "Marcus..." Miguel's voice carried a warning. "What exactly are you planning?" "Compliance with community standards. Karen wants to talk about property values and neighborhood aesthetics. I'm going to give her a dramatic demonstration of both." Another pause. "This wouldn't happen to involve making a point about backup power systems, would it? It might involve ensuring that every resident of Willowbrook Estates has access to reliable electrical service." Miguel chuckled, a sound that held more menace than humor. "You know, I've got some leave time coming. And Rodriguez just finished his electrician's certification. Pretty sure Johnson's still running that equipment rental business. I'm not asking you to..." Marcus, you saved my ass in Kandahar when that IED took out our generator during a firefight. You think I'm gonna let some suburban dictator mess with your medical equipment? The line went quiet for a moment. Besides, I've always wanted to see one of your engineering solutions in action. Give me 6 hours to make some calls. After Miguel hung up, Marcus climbed back upstairs and walked to his front window. Across the street, Karen Whitmore's house sat in pristine darkness, its manicured lawn and perfectly trimmed hedges barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. 2 houses down, Bill Hartman's pickup truck was already gone. He left early for his construction job every morning. Susan Mills's townhouse remained dark, but Marcus knew she'd be up soon to walk her aging retriever. These people had watched Karen threaten his life and said nothing. They'd stood by while she literally cut his lifeline, more concerned about HOA politics than basic human decency. Now they'd learn what consequences looked like when you picked a fight with someone who understood power, both electrical and otherwise. Marcus spent the next hour documenting everything. He photographed the severed cable, the generator setup, the dialysis machine still flashing error codes. He printed copies of his medical exemption letter, Dr. Patel's detailed explanation of his treatment requirements, and the HOA's own bylaws regarding medical accommodations. The paper trail would be important later. At 7 a.m., his doorbell rang. Marcus opened the door to find a tall woman in a business suit, holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Mr. Chen? I'm Janet Morrison from Pinnacle Property Management. We handle administrative functions for your HOA." Marcus had never seen her before, but he wasn't surprised. Karen would want to escalate quickly, probably hoping to intimidate him with legal threats before he could organize any kind of response. "What can I do for you, Ms. Morrison?" "I understand there was an incident last night regarding your generator?" "Yes. Mrs. Whitmore cut my power while I was receiving life-sustaining medical treatment." Janet's smile flickered slightly. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. The HOA board is committed to working with residents to find solutions that benefit everyone. The solution was already in place. I had a medical exemption." "About that." Janet consulted her clipboard. "Upon review, it appears your exemption may not have been properly processed. There are some technical issues with the documentation." Marcus had been expecting this. "What technical issues?" "The medical necessity letter needs to be notarized, and it requires approval from the Architectural Review Committee, not just the Medical Exemptions Board." "The Architectural Review Committee? For medical equipment?" Generator installations fall under their purview, regardless of the reason for installation. Marcus stepped onto his porch, forcing Janet to back down one step. "Ms. Morrison, are you telling me that the HOA retroactively invalidated my medical exemption after already accepting it for 3 months? I'm telling you that proper procedures need to be followed. The board is willing to expedite the review process, but until then, the generator cannot operate during quiet hours." "And if I need dialysis during quiet hours?" Janet's smile became more strained. "That sounds like a question for your medical team, not your HOA." The casual dismissal was almost identical to Karen's response the night before. Marcus realized this wasn't just Karen's personal crusade. It was institutional indifference backed by bureaucratic procedures designed to wear down opposition. "I see," Marcus said quietly. "And how long does this expedited review process typically take?" 4 to 6 weeks, assuming all documentation is properly submitted." 4 to 6 weeks, yes. The Architectural Review Committee only meets monthly, and they need time to properly evaluate. "Ms. Morrison," Marcus interrupted, "I need dialysis 4 times a day, every day, including during your quiet hours." "I understand that's inconvenient." "Inconvenient?" Marcus's voice carried enough edge to make Janet take another step back. "My kidneys don't work. Without dialysis, toxins build up in my blood until I go into cardiac arrest and die. That's not inconvenient. That's fatal." For the first time, Janet's professional composure cracked slightly. Mr. Chen, I'm just here to explain the administrative process. No, you're here to deliver a threat wrapped in bureaucratic language. The message is clear. Comply with HOA demands or face legal consequences. Janet straightened her shoulders. The HOA has every right to enforce its covenants. Your signature on the agreement gives us that authority. My signature was on an agreement that included medical exemptions, which are subject to proper approval procedures. They stared at each other for a long moment. Marcus could see Janet mentally calculating whether to push harder or retreat to report back to Karen. I'll need time to review the documentation requirements, Marcus said finally. Relief flickered across Janet's features. Of course, I'll email you the necessary forms. If you have any questions, I won't. Janet retreated to her car, a silver BMW with vanity plates reading Prop MGR. As she drove away, Marcus noticed curtains twitching in several nearby windows. The neighbors were watching, waiting to see how this would play out. They wouldn't have to wait long. At 10 a.m., Miguel Torres arrived in a Ford F-350, pulling a equipment trailer. Behind him came two more trucks, Rodriguez in a panel van loaded with electrical supplies, and Johnson's equipment rental truck carrying what looked like half a construction site's worth of generators, lights, and industrial cable. Marcus met them in his driveway as neighbors began emerging from their houses to watch the convoy. Karen Whitmore appeared on her front porch, phone already pressed to her ear. "Miguel," Marcus said, embracing his old friend. "Thanks for coming." "Wouldn't miss it." Miguel gestured to the other men. "You remember Rodriguez and Johnson?" Marcus shook hands with both men. Rodriguez looked exactly the same as he had in Afghanistan, compact, serious, and completely unimpressed by suburban drama. Johnson had traded his army uniform for contractor gear, but his handshake still carried the confidence of someone who could build anything with the right tools and enough time. "So," Johnson said, surveying Marcus's house and yard, "where are we setting up this demonstration? Front yard, side yard, and every legal parking spot on the street." Marcus's property erupted into a blazing constellation of industrial LED floodlights that turned night into artificial day. The stadium-grade lighting system cast harsh white illumination across every surface, creating stark shadows that stretched, like accusing fingers toward neighboring houses. The mobile power unit hummed with quiet efficiency, its battery banks delivering clean, silent electricity to a light show that could be seen from 3 miles away. But Marcus wasn't finished. At EI 7:15, he activated Phase 2. Emergency lighting systems blazed to life along his driveway, synchronized to flash in sequence like an airport runway. LED strip lights wrapped around every tree branch. Post and architectural feature on his property began pulsing in rhythmic waves of color, red, white, and blue cascading in patterns that hypnotized and overwhelmed. At 7:30, the sound system engaged. "Good evening, Willowbrook Estates," Marcus's voice boomed across the neighborhood through speakers powerful enough to fill a concert venue. "This is your neighbor, Marcus Chen. I hope everyone is enjoying this beautiful Tuesday evening." Windows began opening throughout the subdivision as residents emerged to investigate the sudden transformation of their quiet suburban street into what looked like a cross between a rock concert and an alien landing site. "As many of you now know," Marcus continued, his amplified voice carrying clearly to every house within a quarter-mile radius. "Last night, the HOA board made the decision to cut power to my life-sustaining medical equipment. This was done to enforce quiet-hour noise ordinances that apparently take precedence over preventing my death." Karen Whitmore's voice could be heard screaming from the direction of the community center, though her words were lost beneath Marcus's amplified announcement. "In the interest of full transparency and community education, I want to share some information about backup power systems and their importance for medical equipment users." The lighting display shifted into a new pattern, gentle pulses that synchronized with his words, creating a hypnotic visual rhythm that made it impossible to look away. My peritoneal dialysis machine requires uninterrupted power for 4-hour treatment cycles that occur 4 times daily. When power is interrupted during a cycle, toxic fluid remains in my abdominal cavity, potentially causing peritonitis, septic shock, and death within hours. Mrs. Patterson stood on her front porch in her bathrobe, hands clasped over her mouth, in horror. David and Lisa Chen had come outside with their twin toddlers, who pointed excitedly at the light show while their parents listened with growing outrage. Last night, HOA President Karen Whitmore made the conscious decision to sever my electrical power during an active dialysis cycle. When I explained that this action could kill me, she informed me that my medical condition did not make me special, and that community standards took precedence over my survival. The sound system carried Marcus's words with crystal clarity to every corner of the neighborhood. He'd calibrated the volume perfectly, loud enough to ensure everyone could hear, but not so loud as to violate actual noise ordinances. This was precision psychological warfare, not random disruption. Miguel stood beside the main control panel, monitoring power distribution and making minor adjustments to optimize the light display. Rodriguez worked at a secondary station, fine-tuning the audio system to eliminate feedback while maximizing clarity. Johnson patrolled the perimeter, checking connections and ensuring every component operated within safe parameters. They looked like a military communications team, setting up a forward command post, which in many ways they were. The equipment you see tonight represents a backup power system capable of supporting not just my medical needs, but the electrical requirements of our entire neighborhood during emergency situations. This mobile power unit, which I designed for disaster relief organizations, can generate and store enough electricity to keep 50 homes operational for 72 hours during natural disasters. The lighting shifted again, this time highlighting specific components of the installation. Spotlights illuminated the battery banks, the solar charging arrays, the distribution panels, and the backup generators arranged like pieces of a technological chess set across his property. I offer this demonstration not out of spite, but as an educational opportunity. Many of you may be wondering what reliable, professional-grade backup power actually looks like. Now you know. Karen's BMW came screeching around the corner, followed by Janet Morrison's silver sedan and 2 other cars Marcus didn't recognize. The emergency board meeting had apparently adjourned in chaos, with the entire HOA leadership racing back to deal with the crisis. Karen slammed her car door and marched. Across Marcus's front lawn, her face twisted with rage. She wore a navy blazer and matching skirt, her official HOA board meeting outfit, but her carefully styled hair had come undone, and her makeup was smeared with stress-induced perspiration. "Turn this off immediately!" she screamed, though her voice was nearly lost beneath the sound system's output. "This is harassment! This is a violation of every noise and lighting ordinance in the book." Marcus calmly activated a wireless microphone, and his voice boomed from the speakers. "Good evening, Karen. Thank you for joining us. I hope you can appreciate the educational value of tonight's power systems demonstration." Educational value? Karen's voice cracked with fury. "This is revenge, pure and simple revenge!" "Actually, this is compliance," Marcus replied, his amplified words carrying to the growing crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the confrontation. "You expressed concern about my generator's impact on community standards. Tonight I'm demonstrating what community-appropriate backup power systems actually look like." Janet Morrison had emerged from her car with what looked like legal documents and a tablet computer. She approached the property line but stopped short of actually stepping onto Marcus's land, probably on advice from whatever lawyer she'd consulted during the emergency board meeting. "Mr. Chen," Janet called out, her professional composure strained. But intact, this installation violates multiple HOA covenants regarding lighting, noise, and aesthetic standards. You need to shut it down immediately or face legal consequences. Marcus's response echoed across the neighborhood. "Ms. Morrison, I've reviewed the HOA covenants extensively today. Would you like me to share my findings with our neighbors?" Without Waiting for a response, Marcus activated a projector that cast images onto the side of his house. The first slide showed the relevant section of the HOA agreement. Section 8.2, Emergency Preparedness. The association encourages homeowners to maintain adequate backup power systems for medical equipment, home security, and emergency communications. Janet's face went pale as she realized what Marcus had discovered. The second slide appeared. Section 8.3, Community Emergency Response. During declared emergencies, homeowners with backup power capabilities are encouraged to assist neighbors without adequate preparation. Karen stared at the projections, her mouth working silently as she processed the implications. The HOA covenants not only permitted backup power systems, they actively encouraged them. Furthermore, Marcus continued, Section 12.7 specifically prohibits the association from taking any action that interferes with life-sustaining medical equipment, regardless of other covenant provisions. The third slide showed the exact text, highlighted in yellow for emphasis. Bill Hartman had arrived and stood beside Karen, but he was staring at the projections rather than supporting her position. Susan Mills remained in her car, talking frantically. On her phone. "The covenants are clear," Marcus announced. "Not only do I have the right to maintain backup power for medical equipment, but the association has an obligation to support such installations. Last night's actions by the HOA board violated both the letter and spirit of our community agreement." Karen found her voice again. "Those provisions don't give you the right to turn the neighborhood into a circus." "Actually, Karen, they do." Marcus's tone remained calm, conversational, almost friendly. Section 8.2 places no restrictions on the size, scope, or operational parameters of emergency backup systems. You wanted me to comply with community standards? This installation exceeds every standard specified in our covenants. More neighbors had gathered, creating a crowd of 30 or 40 people scattered across lawns and sidewalks. Marcus recognized most of them, though he'd rarely spoken to many before tonight. The shared experience of watching their HOA president's authority challenged seemed to be creating an impromptu sense of community. Mrs. Rodriguez, the woman with the excessively colorful rose garden that Karen had waged war against, stood near, the front of the crowd, with the expression of pure satisfaction. The Patel family had brought folding chairs, as if they were settling in to watch an outdoor movie. Even teenagers from several houses had emerged from their usual electronic isolation to witness the spectacle. "You can't keep this running indefinitely," Karen said, her voice now carrying a note of desperation. "The utility company will shut you down for drawing excessive power from the grid." Marcus smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. "Karen, that's the beautiful thing about a properly designed backup power system. It doesn't draw power from the grid. It generates its own." The fourth. Dawn broke over Willowbrook Estates to reveal a neighborhood transformed. Marcus's power installation had operated flawlessly through the night, its LED arrays automatically dimming with the sunrise, while the battery systems continued their silent vigil. But the real transformation wasn't technological, it was social. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were gathered in small groups on sidewalks and driveways, discussing the previous night's events with the animated energy of people who had witnessed something unprecedented. The shared experience of watching Karen Whitmore's authority collapse had created an impromptu sense of community that the HOA's mandatory social events had never achieved. Marcus stood in his front yard with a cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up to its new reality. His phone had been buzzing constantly since midnight with text messages from neighbors he barely knew, offering support and asking questions about the power system. The transformation from isolated medical patient to community focal point had happened so quickly it felt surreal. Miguel emerged from the house carrying 2 more cups of coffee and handed one to Rodriguez, who was checking overnight system logs on a tablet computer. "How'd we do?" Marcus asked. "Perfect operation," Rodriguez replied. Zero power fluctuations, battery banks maintained optimal charge, grid feedback stayed within utility specifications. This thing ran smoother than most hospital backup systems I've worked on. Any complaints? Miguel grinned. Define complaints. Mrs. Patterson called around midnight to say her power had never been more stable. The Chen family, the young couple with twins, sent a text asking if you'd teach their kids about renewable energy. And apparently half the neighborhood wants to know if you'll design backup systems for their houses. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. The demonstration had been calculated to showcase capability rather than just make a point. Show people what was possible, and they'd start wanting it for themselves. Any word from Karen? Radio silence. Her house went dark around 2 a.m. and stayed. That way, that was unusual. Karen typically started her days early, bustling around her meticulously maintained property before leaving for her job at a mortgage company downtown. The fact that her house remained dark and quiet suggested she was either hiding from the aftermath of last night's confrontation or planning some kind of counterattack. Marcus suspected the latter. At 8:30 a.m., his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Chen, this is David Martinez from Channel 7 News. We received a tip about some kind of neighborhood power dispute involving medical equipment. We'd like to send a crew out to cover the story. Marcus felt a chill of anticipation. Someone had called. The media, and given the timing, it wasn't hard to guess who. Karen had probably spent the early morning hours working her contacts, trying to spin the situation as a story about one man's revenge disrupting an entire community. What exactly did your tip say? Something about an HOA dispute escalating into harassment involving industrial lighting and noise violations? The caller mentioned that a resident was using medical needs as an excuse to circumvent community standards. There it was. Karen was trying to control the narrative by getting her version of events to the media first. She was framing Marcus as the aggressor and herself as the victim of his overreaction. Mr. Martinez, I'd be happy to speak with your crew, but I think you should know that the story is more complex than your source suggested. This involves an HOA cutting power to life-sustaining medical equipment. A pause. Life-sustaining equipment? Peritoneal. Dialysis. I nearly died Tuesday night when the HOA president severed my electrical power during treatment to enforce noise ordinances. The tone of the conversation shifted immediately. David Martinez had just realized he wasn't dealing with a petty neighborhood dispute. He was looking at a story about medical discrimination that could have ended in wrongful death. Mr. Chen, we'd like to get a crew out there as soon as possible. Would 10 a.m. work? That would be fine. I have all the documentation of Tuesday night's events, plus medical records and HOA correspondence. After hanging up, Marcus called Miguel and Rodriguez over to discuss media strategy. The news coverage would determine how this story reached the broader community, and they needed to be prepared for Karen's attempts to spin the narrative. She's going to claim you're the aggressor, Miguel said. Neighborhood terrorist with much equipment, using medical needs as an excuse to harass people. Let her try, Rodriguez added. We've got documentation, witnesses, and video from last night, plus the HOA's own covenants support what you're doing. Marcus nodded, but he knew media coverage was unpredictable. Television news thrived on conflict and drama, not nuanced discussions of HOA policy and medical equipment regulations. The challenge would be keeping the focus on Karen's actions rather than his response. At 9:45 a.m., a white van with the Channel 7 logo pulled up to the curb, followed by Karen's BMW and Janet Morrison's silver sedan. Karen had been waiting for the media to arrive, probably hoping to intercept them before they spoke with Marcus. David Martinez emerged from the news van, a compact man in his 30s with the kind of aggressive energy that suggested he'd built his career covering conflict stories. Behind him came a camera operator and a sound technician, both already surveying the scene with professional interest. Karen intercepted them before they reached Marcus's property line. Mr. Martinez, I'm Karen Whitmore, president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA. I'm the one who called your newsroom about this situation. Martinez shook her hand, but kept walking toward Marcus's house. "Mrs. Whitmore, thank you for the tip. We'll definitely want to get your perspective on camera. But first, I need to understand the medical equipment situation Mr. Chen described." "Mr. Chen is exaggerating the medical aspects to justify his harassment of our community," Karen said quickly. "This is really about one man's refusal to follow basic noise ordinances that every other resident manages to comply with." "So you did cut power to his medical equipment?" Karen hesitated, realizing she'd just confirmed the most damaging part of the story. "The HOA enforced community standards that Mr. Chen had agreed to follow when he purchased his home. Even though it could have killed him, that's a dramatic exaggeration." "Mrs. Whitmore," Martinez interrupted, "peritoneal dialysis is life-sustaining treatment. Interrupting the process can cause fatal complications. Are you saying the HOA wasn't aware of this when you cut his power?" Marcus could see Karen struggling to find an answer that didn't make her sound like either an attempted murderer or completely incompetent. Either she'd known that cutting his power could kill him and done it anyway, or she'd made a decision that could have killed him without bothering to understand the consequences. Janet Morrison stepped forward, probably hoping to provide damage control. "Mr. Martinez, the HOA board followed established procedures for covenant enforcement. Mr. Chen's medical exemption had procedural issues that needed to be resolved. After you'd already accepted it for 3 months?" Janet's professional composure cracked slightly. "The exemption process is complex, and sometimes administrative issues aren't discovered until someone complains about generator noise." Martinez had clearly done his homework during the drive-over. Someone, probably his producer, had researched HOA medical exemption policies and discovered the problems with retroactive revocation of previously approved accommodations. "Mr. Chen," Martinez called out, "could we get your side of this story?" Marcus walked over to meet the news crew, carrying a folder of documentation. "Of course. Would you like to see the power line that was cut Tuesday night?" The camera operator began filming as Marcus led them to the side yard where the severed electrical cable still lay on the ground. The cut was clean and deliberate, obviously made with bolt cutters rather than damaged by weather or accident. "This was done at 12:23 a.m. Wednesday morning," Marcus said, "approximately 90 minutes into a 4-hour dialysis cycle. Mrs. Whitmore used bolt cutters to sever this line after I explained that interrupting the process could cause fatal complications." Martinez examined the cut cable while the camera captured close-up footage. "What did you do when the power went out?" "I had to manually disconnect from the machine and go to the emergency room for urgent treatment. The incomplete dialysis cycle left toxic fluid in my abdominal cavity that could have caused septic shock. And the HOA knew this when they cut the power?" I explained the medical consequences in detail. "Mrs. Whitmore told me that my medical condition didn't make me special, and that community standards took precedence over my survival." The camera swung to Karen, who had gone pale at hearing her exact words repeated on camera. Martinez walked over to her with the kind of predatory focus that experienced reporters develop when they smell a career-defining story. "Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Chen says you told him his medical condition didn't make him special. Is that accurate?" "That's taken out of context. What context makes it acceptable to tell someone their medical needs don't matter?" Karen looked desperately at Janet Morrison, who was frantically taking notes on her tablet, probably researching legal liability for HOAs that interfere with medical treatment. "The HOA has to enforce standards equally for all residents," Karen said weakly. "We can't make exceptions just because someone claims medical needs." Claims med. 3 weeks later, Marcus Chen stood before a packed community center as the newly elected president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA. The recall election had been a landslide. Karen Whitmore received exactly 3 votes out of 147 cast, and 2 of those were later discovered to be fraudulent absentee ballots submitted by Janet Morrison on behalf of residents who had moved away months earlier. But the election was merely the visible conclusion of a much more comprehensive destruction. The morning after the security footage revealed Karen's attempted sabotage, Marcus had made a series of phone calls that set in motion events Karen couldn't have anticipated. His first call went to Tom Bradley, an investigative reporter for the state's largest newspaper who specialized in municipal corruption and HOA fraud. "Tom, this is Marcus Chen. Miguel Torres said you might be interested in a story about HOA financial irregularities. Miguel mentioned you had some documentation." "More than documentation. I have a complete financial analysis showing systematic misappropriation of HOA funds, fraudulent vendor contracts, and what appears to be embezzlement disguised as management fees." Marcus had spent the previous week conducting the kind of forensic accounting that his engineering background made possible. While Karen focused on media damage control, he'd been dissecting 3 years of HOA financial records with the methodical precision of someone who understood complex systems. What he'd found was even worse than simple corruption. Karen Whitmore and Janet Morrison had been running a sophisticated fraud scheme that diverted nearly 30% of HOA fees into shell companies they controlled. Maintenance contracts were inflated and split between legitimate work and payments to fictitious vendors. Insurance claims were filed for repairs that never happened, with settlements disappearing into administrative accounts that existed only on paper. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and brazen in its scope. They'd stolen nearly $300,000 over 3 years, counting on homeowner apathy and the complexity of HOA finances to hide their theft. But Marcus wasn't just an engineer. He was a military engineer, trained to analyze enemy systems and identify critical vulnerabilities. And Karen Whitmore had just handed him the tools to destroy her completely. Tom Bradley's investigation launched a cascade of consequences that Karen couldn't control or deflect. The state attorney general's office opened a criminal investigation. The FBI became interested when the scope of the fraud crossed state lines through interstate banking transactions. The IRS discovered unreported income and tax evasion. Within a week, Janet Morrison had fled the state and Pinnacle Property Management had declared bankruptcy. Karen found herself facing 17 felony charges and civil litigation from every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates. But Marcus's most devastating weapon wasn't legal or financial, it was social. The enhanced security footage showing Karen's attempted sabotage had been edited into a comprehensive video presentation that documented her entire pattern of behavior. Marcus screened it at a packed community meeting, narrating her actions with the clinical precision of a military briefing. At 0317 hours, the subject approached the main electrical distribution panel and attempted to access emergency shutdown controls. Analysis of her movements indicates familiarity with electrical systems and deliberate intent to cause equipment failure. The footage showed Karen examining connection points, testing access panels, and clearly searching for ways to disable the power system. Her own security cameras had captured her leaving her house at 3:10 a.m. and returning at 3:40 a.m., proving premeditation. The subject's actions demonstrate conscious disregard for the safety of medical equipment users and willful intent to create electrical hazards that could endanger multiple residents. The room full of neighbors watched in stunned silence as their former HOA president was revealed as someone who would sneak around in the middle of the night to sabotage medical equipment. Whatever remaining support she might have had evaporated completely. But the coup de grace came when Marcus revealed the true scope of Karen's fraud. Financial analysis reveals that Mrs. Whitmore's enforcement of HOA covenants was systematically designed to generate fine revenue for personal enrichment. Residents who questioned board decisions faced increased scrutiny and manufactured violations. The Architectural Review Committee was weaponized to extract penalty payments from homeowners who couldn't afford legal challenges. Marcus projected spreadsheets showing the correlation between resident complaints and subsequent fine assessments. Karen had been targeting anyone who opposed her authority, using HOA powers to punish dissent and fund her theft. Mrs. Rodriguez's Rose Garden violations generated $4,200 in fines over 18 months. The Patel family's mailbox dispute resulted in $2,800 in penalties. The Johnson family faced $3,600 in architectural violations after questioning landscape contractor billing. The pattern was clear and damning. Karen hadn't just been a petty tyrant. She'd been a criminal who used community authority to fund her crimes and silence opposition. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up from the audience, her voice shaking with rage. "You mean she stole our money and then fined us for questioning her?" "That's exactly what happened," Marcus confirmed. The enforcement actions were retaliatory measures designed to prevent residents from discovering the financial fraud. The room erupted in angry voices as neighbors realized they'd been victims of a systematic conspiracy. The woman they'd trusted to manage their community had been robbing them while using HOA rules as weapons against anyone who might expose her crimes. Bill Hartman, who had remained loyal to Karen through the medical equipment controversy, stood up with tears in his eyes. "She fined us $2,500 last year for a fence height violation. We had to take out a loan to pay it. All this time she was stealing from us?" "The fence violation was manufactured," Marcus replied, consulting his documentation. "Your fence meets all covenant specifications. The fine was assessed because you questioned landscape contractor billing at a board meeting. The social destruction was complete and irreversible." Karen Whitmore wasn't just facing criminal charges. She was facing a community that now understood the full scope of her betrayal. But Marcus had saved the most elegant punishment for last. On the day Karen's criminal trial began, Marcus activated the final phase of his response to her actions. A convoy of vehicles arrived at Willowbrook Estates carrying equipment that dwarfed his original power installation. The Department of Homeland Security had selected the neighborhood as a pilot location for community emergency preparedness, based on Marcus's successful demonstration of residential backup power systems. The federal grant provided funding for a permanent community microgrid that could operate independently during natural disasters or infrastructure failures. Solar arrays, battery storage, wind generation, and backup fuel cells would ensure that no resident would ever lose power during emergencies. And Marcus Chen, as the system's designer and the neighborhood's new HOA president, would personally oversee every aspect of its operation. Karen's attempts to control community aesthetics had resulted in the transformation of Willowbrook Estates into a showcase for renewable energy technology. Her obsession with property values had attracted federal investment that made every home in the neighborhood more valuable than comparable properties without emergency power infrastructure. Most ironically, her efforts to silence Marcus's noisy generator had led to the installation of a power system so advanced that it operated in complete silence while providing enough electricity to make the neighborhood energy independent. But the sweetest irony was yet to come. At Karen's sentencing hearing, Marcus submitted a victim impact statement that was read aloud in open court. "Your Honor, Mrs. Whitmore's actions on the night of August 10th were not an isolated incident of poor judgment. They were part of a systematic pattern of using community authority to harm residents who questioned her decisions. Her willingness to endanger my life over a noise complaint was consistent with her use of HOA powers to retaliate against anyone who threatened her criminal enterprise. However, I want the court to know that Mrs. Whitmore's actions, while reprehensible, have had an unexpected positive outcome. Her attack on my medical equipment led to the discovery of her financial crimes, which led to the federal investigation that secured emergency preparedness funding for our community. In trying to silence one generator, Mrs. Whitmore inadvertently triggered the installation of a power system that will protect our neighbors for decades to come. Her attempt to prioritize property values over human life resulted in federal investment that made our properties more valuable than she ever imagined possible. Mrs. Whitmore tried to kill me to enforce her vision of community standards. Instead, she created a community that exceeds every standard she claimed to value. The judge sentenced Karen to 6 years in federal prison for fraud, conspiracy, and tax evasion. She was ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus penalties that would consume any remaining assets she might have hidden. Janet Morrison received 8 years after pleading guilty to conspiracy charges and agreeing to testify against Karen. Pinnacle Property Management was permanently barred from operating in the state, but Marcus's final triumph wasn't legal or financial, it was deeply personal.